Today's episode is sponsored by Codega's Bodega. If you guys want to get some clean merch, go to Codega's Bodega to support the community. And also to make a statement when you're going out on the streets, so you can let your weirdness be seen. The link will be down in the description below. Let's get to it.
Because when you start folding history onto a few hundred years, you start to see these specific people, you can move them forward and backward, and somehow they're still responsible for the major innovations of their time.
The Codega is a guide and a storyteller, escorting you through the night, lighting the way, warding off thieves, ghosts, demons, and other oddities. Along the journey, his companions would often share with him the most curious of stories that he'd record in his Codex. Perhaps you just might find yourself traveling with the Codega and sharing one of yours. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Codega's Codex of Curiosities. I'm Bri, the Codega, and tonight we are going to go into cycles, do-overs, repeating, folding over, Fibonacci, golden ratio, Amorites, and what else? The watch? That is just to name a few of the things that we are going to talk about tonight with my guest, Michael Anthony Alberta. Now, he has done I don't want to use a word, but I will, plethora of research all on these topics. He has overlaid generation after generation, and he's starting to break things down to see that when did we really become unique? When did we really become with an introspective, not introverted, but an introspective reasoning? What did that entail? Now, we're also going to Quetzalcoatl and much deeper. Like it's a tie-in with Egypt, the ancient Greeks, the Vatican, and Mesoamerica as well, which is just up my alley, literally just out the back door. All right, so that is just a taste of what's to come. Now, everybody, if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please just hit pause. Go give me a 5-star review. I really appreciate it. It really helps the show. It helps the show to be broadcast to more people, or presented, or it gives them impressions, as we call it, and then other people will see it, get a chance to be like, hey, what is this? And then they can click on it, and then they can give this a shot. You give it a try, have a listen, see if you like it, and I hope you do. It really does help the show. Also, if you're sick and tired of these ads that are always playing, whether it be on YouTube or on Spotify or Apple, go check out my Patreon. I have audio content, no ads, and with some bonus content as well. Like, speaking of Mesoamerica, I just released a bonus episode with Brad and myself where I was on Brad's show, and now you can find that episode in the Patreon for $7 a month. What is that? It's a freaking Starbucks coffee. One of those frappe, latte, venti kind of drinks. Well, you can be getting your own episodes. No advertisements. Here we go. All right, everyone. Let's just not waste any more time. Let's go bring Michael Anthony to the stage. Now, Michael, welcome to Codega's Codex of Curiosities.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. It's an honor. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, I know you reached out and contacted me, and you kind of gave a premise of what we're going to talk about today, and it really intrigued me, and I thought this is something that I would love to hear more of. So before we jump into that, let's what I'd love for you to tell my listeners and viewers a little bit about yourself and where they can find you as well.
Sure. So my name is Michael Anthony Alberta. My website is listed here. It's my name with .com, michaelanthonyalberta.com. I'm a personal trainer by trade. I also do virtual personal training.
Cool.
And yeah, I bounce around the planet, just living in different places. And I'm also a virtual assistant, basically trying to make money from the internet any possible way.
So a digital nomad,
within reason.
Yeah.
No OnlyFans. No OnlyFans. Not yet. I'm too old for that anyway.
To
But anyway, yeah, no, I mean, that's essentially me, and I'm a huge history buff. I was intimately studying history for decades now. But this specific work that we're going to be talking about this evening is about a decade in the making.
oh wow,
Revisiting
yeah.
Wikipedia pages, because that's essentially what, when we talk about history's repeated patterns, because that's what the name of the subtitle of the book is. It's Encrypted Reality. Um, and understanding history's repeated patterns. In order to do that, what I initially did, this was before large language models and AI and stuff like that. I was using the internet. I was using Wikipedia and revisiting Wikipedia pages over a decade. And periodically seeing what's changed, what's stuck, and superimposing timelines over each other. So, I would say, give me a timeline of the history of mathematics, for example, and then a timeline of the history of the alphabet. And then I would look at the comparisons, say, okay, this came in there, this came. Then I would say, okay, give me the history of agriculture or the history of metal smelting, different histories, and then eventually I would start to see a fractal emerge. And initially, it was just it was a hobby. I was just, we were talking about earlier off camera how initially I was in this really started to really crystallize in Tenerife, which is one of the Canary Islands off the coast of Spain, which is really closer to North Africa. And there's a huge Phoenician imprint there. And when I started to really, it was just fun. I was just loving just studying this history, and I felt like I was like almost living generations, just within a month or two of gluing myself to Wikipedia on Adderall. But what happened was, I just fell in love with it, but after about 5 years, I knew I had like a story. There was an actual narrative that I felt almost like I was meant to tell, but I mean, ultimately, yeah. I mean, I was digging, and it seemed as though that there is a really profound story that I believe the world should know. So I really invested my time to articulate that, and that's essentially, and it's an ongoing process. I mean, there is one book that's on Amazon called The Renaissance Man, Portrait of a Spy Master. That is my initial stab at this timeline rather, before AI and stuff like that. So it's basically frozen in, it's like a time capsule on Amazon. This is but it's remarkably similar to what I basically expanded on it using large language models just to vet the information, because a lot of this stuff called me out on things that I wasn't even aware of, helped me introduce new aspects to it. But fundamentally, yes, it started from Wikipedia and uncovering the patterns, the base patterns in Wikipedia timelines, different people's biographies, and then matching up dates. It was very important to match up the death dates, the when they were born, when the certain things were. And yes, I came to this conclusion. And what I'm going to try to do today, Rye, instead of because on my last conversation I had with the Irish Inquisition, excuse me, the Amish Inquisition, I basically read from my book, and I
Okay.
took different snippets from my book, not completely, but I would read like sentences, in some cases paragraphs, and then maybe expand on it, because initially when we spoke, I wanted to get into the Amorites more, and then the Karaites, but in reality, you'd have to listen to my other podcast to really,
To
and
really
that was
get the full meal deal of it. Okay.
exactly. So it's better that I kind of give you guys a more broader. But what we can do though, it's when you said you wanted to focus on the patterns. I'm like, you know what? Why don't I concentrate on the Fibonacci sequence or the phi ratio,
Okay. Yep.
which kind of weaves in and out of the book. It also helps me tell the story of encrypted reality. So it's simultaneously.
And you
So
had
if you don't
also,
mind,
yeah, of course, and you had also mentioned Leon Battista Alberti, right?
yes,
As
yes,
is he
yes.
going to be coming up in this conversation as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. So,
Fantastic,
so
fantastic.
He'll be coming up right now, basically. So
Okay.
within the iconic symbolism of Leonardo's, this is Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. The profound integration of phi, also recognized as the golden ratio or divine proportion, is clearly apparent. So I'll pause there. So the Vitruvian Man, Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian. Number one, Leonardo da Vinci is it's a proven historical fact that he studied under Alberti. And Alberti, like for example, the Vitruvian Man is named after the work of Vitruvius. Now, Alberti's nickname was Florentine Vitruvius because he was the person that translated um, the old because Vitruvius is actually an architect from the first century, from like the time of Christ. He allegedly uh, recovered these documents, which with another person, Brogio Boccinelli, but he was essentially the person that translated it and articulated the information that we see in. And Leonardo basically took the information that Alberti articulated in his books and his treaties, and basically made a depiction of the mathematical sequences, because these are things that were discussed by Vitruvius allegedly centuries earlier. Now, what's funny though is that there's a mathematician named Anatoly Fomenko who has a whole statistical method, and he's written like a series of about 20 books called The New Chronology, which he argues that, similar to me, because I actually borrow from him in this respect, that most of world history was folded onto the 15th century and doesn't really go back any much further than the 12th century. But one major thing that actually brought me to Anatoly Fomenko's work was he said that Vitruvius was in fact Alberti. These are figures of one and the same, because obviously when you fold history onto the 15th century, there's going to be a lot of phantom reflections going on, in the
Okay.
1400s. So Vitruvius and Alberti are one and the same. And then when you say, okay, what is Fomenko's? How does he say that? How does he rationalize history being fabricated in the 15th century? And he says, yeah, between the printing press, which is one of the most, historically, this is one of the most important inventions of all time in terms of our behavioral modernity. We have the alphabet, the printing press. Then obviously now we have the
The
internet,
internet. Yeah.
large language models. But in that time, that was a time of huge change. This is prior to the printing press. Most people weren't literate. This is a proven fact. This is a historical. The people that actually had the ability to read and write were usually priests or the elite. And that made literacy much more accessible to the modern man. But let me just stick to uh, uh, Anatoly Fomenko's claims, because what he does is he also says it's not just the printing press. It was a series of things: the printing press, guns, and the nautical sail, because that helped us circumnavigate. And it kind of makes sense when you add all three of these things. And there was other things too, like for example, the fall of Constantinople, where all that Greek knowledge from Turkey came flushed into Florence. And this is where Alberti was at the time. And this is where you have things like the Neoplatonic Academy with Michelangelo, all the Ninja Turtles, a bunch of artists and people that could have very well fabricated history at this time. It's feasible. This is not something that's too far fetched. I'm not saying all of history, but I think a large chunk of what we consider to be ancient is a product of that time period. So yeah, that's what kind of ties in. If you have any questions, right, or
Yeah.
if I'm
Of course. Of course.
bulldozing,
Yeah. No problem. Right now, I'm just taking it in as you're going, kind of thing.
all right, cool. So, let me put my mouse on my other computer so it's easy for me to get through this
Yeah. No
doc.
problem.
Excuse me. But yeah, so basically, so Leonardo studied under Alberti. Now I think Alberti, he was part of an international spy ring, quite, because what happens is when you look at what he was doing, he was responsible. He worked under Pope Pius II and Pope Nicholas V, two very important popes. When you look at the history of the Vatican, like the actual Vatican, when it was built under Alberti never really created anything. Like, for example, like with Leonardo da Vinci created the Vitruvian Man based on Alberti basically wrote a bunch of treaties that other artists would use that information to produce things. Um, so when I say Alberti is part of aspiring, I say it because during the time of the Vatican, this is where like one of the biggest libraries in the world, the Vatican Library, this is when all of this supposed lost information from the so-called Dark Ages just conveniently reemerges in Florence. And yes, you could say the Greeks that the Eastern Orthodox Greeks from Constantinople, Eastern Europe came into there. But who's to say that that information wasn't remixed? Because, for example, those are a bunch of Greeks and Romans, Italians, Romans. So, and we have this huge imprint of this Greco-Roman past. So that's what Flamenco argues. I don't necessarily think that all of the history was totally fabricated, but yes, there is definitely there's something to that. But let me continue with the Fibonacci sequence and the
Yeah,
phi
and
ratio
and I
because
do
that
agree with this, this history being fabricated. That is something that has been coming up more and more. Where there's a lot of things that are just kind of not fitting right. And it's not really fitting into narratives that they should be. And we're told, oh no, this is how this happened, but it just doesn't fit correctly.
yeah, I mean we can just see that playing out in front of our we have this is based on books, but we even have cameras and everything, and we still have to deal with fake news. And if you look at different news networks, depending on which network you're watching, it could be a completely different rendition of what happened, or at least what the consensus of what happens, because everyone has their own spin.
I agree completely. And that worries me is like what is being written in our history books. And
Yes,
I know that the lies are being written in there. We don't know exactly the actual truth, but I know what they're writing is lies. And so if we can see that clear as day, what's to say like we'd just be like, oh, this is just happening now? No, 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 no. I think this has been happening for quite some time. In reality, it takes one generation to forget the truth. One generation, when one
right?
generation has moved on, then the next generation who is learning the lies are just going to believe these lies because that's all they've been taught.
Yeah, exactly. So you ask yourself, how is it even possible that how is it possible to people forget to get away with this? Like, for example, the in history now, like for example, when I watch the news, it's statistics are a good way of kind of arriving at the consensus of what's going on in terms of using the scientific method. But in truth is you can use statistics if you're articulate enough, you can kind of mold them into say whatever message you want. However, I still apply statistical analysis to history. I believe history is like a cryptogram. And the only way you can really solve it is through frequency analysis. And so it's noticing these repetitive patterns. And this doesn't just apply to world history. Like I said earlier, this applies to our own lives. And it's much harder to actually shine. I kind of sometimes use world history as like an out for me because it's easier to just sometimes we regret that we're doing this to ourselves. 90% of the things that we remember as our history is a lot of the times it's distorted within ourselves. And sometimes it takes us to actually journal and write these things down and notice these repetitive patterns and be like, holy shit, I keep doing this. What's up? You
That
know?
is you're hitting the nail on the head. I'm like thinking about myself. It's so much easier to look outside and look at, okay, we're gonna dissect these things, but I'm not gonna pay attention to myself. I'm not gonna look within and
Mm-hmm.
deal with any of my crap. I want to call everybody else out on their conspiracies and all the crap that's going on in the world, but
Right.
I'm just gonna ignore what's going on within. It's true.
It's like,
I'm guilty.
likewise, you and me both, brother. So the Pantheon, and the Pantheon was allegedly created in 1446 BC, purportedly designed and based on phi, which is essentially the Fibonacci sequence, but it's the golden ratio, like we talked about earlier. Remains an enduring architectural symbol of Western civilization. This leads to a puzzling question: When and how did Italians purportedly lose Vitruvius knowledge only to acquire it much later? The use of phi by builders in antiquity is claimed to stem from a misunderstanding or conflation with the golden mean, a Greek philosophical concept emphasizing avoidance of excess in either direction. So allegedly, when you even look into the Greek, into this text, and you look at the golden mean, it doesn't necessarily even stand for a mathematical sequence. The precise period of Roman concrete development remains uncertain. That's another thing. But Vitruvius provided the first recorded reference to it. So Vitruvius also, this document is the first documentation of any kind of building. We have pyramid text, the Rhine papyrus, which I'll get into also pretty soon, which relates to the Fibonacci sequence. So you can see there is a theme dealing with architecture in terms of this distorted history. Also in terms of secret societies, when we think about Freemasons and stuff like this all relates to like the master builder and all this. And it's funny because this Alberti character, when you look at the historical mainstream narrative, he's considered the first actual architect. Like prior to him, there was no one really labeled an architect. Like this Vitruvius character was more like a polymath. He was designing a lot of military equipment, a lot of different, but he wasn't just known as a. That's beside. I don't want to
You don't
get
want to jump
too
too
off
deep down
course.
that hole. Okay.
Right. It's very. That's why I'm trying to stick to the documents because in previous conversations, when I do it sounds almost a little manicky because there's so many directions I can take and I don't know which one that I should go down. So it kind of helps me to read and then like again, right, just stop me if it gets dull or whatever the case. If you have any questions.
No,
So a
I'm doing
figure
good.
named Fibonacci a figure named Fibonacci gained widespread recognition for popularizing a Hindu Arabic numeral system in 1202. His book was called Book of Calculations, thereby introducing a numerical sequence that became fundamental for banking and the innovative double entry bookkeeping system. Which gets into when we talk about the international banksters and huge like the Medici family or the Rothschilds. This is really how they make their fortune. And to this day, this is how banking based on this Fibonacci sequence. It's based on the phi ratio. Um,
Okay.
the Fibonacci sequence in its numerical form embodies phi. That's the best way to explain how phi and Fibonacci sequence. It begins with 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, so on and so forth, and continues indefinitely, with each subsequent number being the sum of the preceding two. He allegedly discovered this sequence by observing natural phenomena. This is Fibonacci, specifically the growth rate of a rabbit population. Fibonacci, also known as Leonardo of Pisa, because again, most people, when you think Leonardo da Vinci, or that most of these guys were named after the cities they were in. So Leonardo Fibonacci didn't like his name isn't really Fibonacci. His name is actually Leonardo of Pisa, similar to Da Vinci. He's just the Leonardo from Vinci, that's the.
Gotcha.
But my point, he ended up being he. Don't get me wrong. I mean, all respect to Leonardo da Vinci, but all right. So Leonardo of Pisa has hailed as one of the most brilliant mathematicians of all time. However, I assert that Franco-Italian historians fabricated his name in 1838. The first documented mention of him is found and appears in historical by the Luca Pacioli in 1506. A notary's reference for a Leonardo Fibonacci is noted. Furthermore, it wasn't until Pacioli's seminal work in 1509 that concrete and direct evidence of Phi's discovery was provided. So, yeah, this suggests that the narrative surrounding Fibonacci and his discovery was likely a retroactive fabrication. Its purpose was to provide a plausible explanation for existing mathematical principles and to further their meticulously reconstructed historical timeline. A similar pattern emerges in the so-called transmission of mathematics from ancient Greek to India and back to Europe. Concepts such as trigonometry, attributed to Hippocrates and to Ptolemy, reappear centuries later in Sanskrit astronomical texts before returning to Renaissance Europe. This closed loop suggests not only a one-way diffusion, but a controlled recycling of knowledge, which the watch. So the watch, I didn't introduce them either. The watch is
Yeah.
this international spy ring that I believe Alberti, um, the name I created because it symbolizes
Okay.
an
Okay.
actual
Because I was
timepiece.
like, well, I was also
Yeah.
thinking, I was
Where's the
also,
watch?
well, no, I was relating it to like the Watchers. Actually, I was like, ooh, the Watchers.
Yeah,
That. Yeah, it
And
has
they
a
do.
yeah.
They do relate to them. They are in fact one and the same. The Watchers, because that's where we get into the Amorites. The Amorites are, see, we'll go off into a whole other direction, but I'll get into that. Basically, the Watchers. The Watchers are who? The Nephilim or the Anunnaki. You know, there's
Yeah,
different
yeah.
names that we
The
give the
fallen. Yeah.
giants,
Yeah.
the fallen ones. Now, historically and biblically, these people were known as Amorites. So if you look at who Og was, or you know, the actual names of these giants and they were Amorites. That was the name of the actual people. And like the Amorites, whether it's forward in time or backward in time, they're rebranding themselves, which I get into detail in the book. And I was going to get into that in this episode, but we could do that some other time because it really is a long-winded thing. However, you can see it's basically the same people reinventing themselves over millennium. So it's either all of history is either folded in on a few hundred years, or in fact these people have somehow just maintained control over, you know, vast swaths of time. I think it could be a little bit of both, but I think a lot of it's just fabricated history. Okay, so the financial technologies resurgence coincided with the rise of Venice, Genoa, and Portugal as maritime empires. So conveniently, the same time double entry bookkeeping reappears in Florence is the same time the age of exploration. It's just, you know, there's a lot of just correspondences to this banking system being, and the fact that it relates to, you know, the Vitruvian Man relates to a lot of other things, the Pyramid of Giza, uh,
Okay.
Teotihuacan in Mexico. There's many things, Angkor Wat in Cambodia.
And how
There's
does
a
it
lot
tie
of
in with
different.
those? Can you tell me how it ties in with those ones?
Yeah, it's cool because I haven't heard anyone really make this connection. How the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio are fundamentally related to double entry bookkeeping, which is the foundations of banking. So, you know, like when you think of hedge fund managers or bankers and stuff, I'm not going to pretend like I know how they use it, but I know, for example, I have a friend that's a trader. He uses the Fibonacci sequence to trade because it could predict how people buy and sell. Because it's a pattern in nature
That's quite a good
that's
pattern to know of for that scenario.
well, it's not just that scenario. This pattern, and I get into this in the book, it's used for calendar systems. It's used for so many different things. Like we measure what's aesthetically pleasing to our eye based on the Fibonacci sequence and the pi
Correct. In the
ratio.
golden ratio. Yes.
Right. And the fact that this relates to how we spend money, but we have to understand money is also a synthetic, you know, that's something we created
It is.
to domesticate ourselves, but it's still a transfer of energy. So no matter which way you go, this sequence is very primal to our being. Um, so by channeling banking innovations through these naval powers, the watch could integrate capital flows with exploratory fleets, excuse me, ensuring that conquest, trade, and historical narrative shaping advance in lockstep. Another significant instance where phi emerges conspicuously is the correlation with the European dates embedded within the Mayan and Aztec long count calendars. So this is I get into this in previous episodes. I don't think Leon Battista was born in Genoa in 1404. I actually think he's from the Americas. I think his original name was Nezahualcóyotl. I actually think humanism was a product of the Americas bringing that to Europe. Because if you look at the cult of Quetzalcoatl, which is one of Nezahualcóyotl's ancestors, I don't want to go off on another tangent. I do,
Well,
believe me, I do. But
just to let
before
you
I
know,
know it,
I just to let you know, I live in Mexico, so Quetzalcoatl, is something
oh,
is a
that's
plant.
awesome, man.
So that's
I
not
love
a yeah. I
Mexico.
know what you're talking about, but it's funny that you say that. So you think humanity actually started in the Americas and branched out?
Well, humanism,
Okay,
uh,
okay.
right?
I one of my another job I have is I tutor English ESL students, so English as a second language
Awesome,
students. I have
that's cool. I
a
volunteer my time with the school, and I help the kids.
oh
You know, they
perfect.
love it. They're like, official gringo.
So I have a Turkish student who is a master chef, and she does a lot of studying food and growing crops from biblical and Quran and everything. She studies in depth, and she is seeing that actually she believes that people were migrating from the Americas to like the Orientals to the Orient. So she believes that actually a lot of things started in the Americas and moved eastward, so to speak, or I guess westward. We would say, they went from the Americas and moved over to.
For that westward, sure.
Yep, yep. It's quite interesting. So she's figuring out this stuff, which is fascinating, fascinating. But sorry
Yeah.
to take us off a different track, but keep going.
No, because there's other correspondences like aqueducts. You can see there's several things. It just so happens Alberti specialized in aqueducts. He's the one that designed all the aqueducts in the Vatican that we see to this day. Uh, but this is the same thing that this Nezahualcóyotl character in Aztec. Nezahualcóyotl is the founder of the Aztec Empire. Okay, but I also think he is another person called Pachacuti in Andean American and Inca in Peru. But that'll get into a whole thing, which I get into. I actually get into a very detailed explanation why. Because originally I thought it was the other way around. When I first was writing the book, I thought it was the Europeans that were basically subverting the locals prior to the major invasion. It was like a soft landing.
Okay.
But
Okay.
no, then when I actually looked into it more, I'm like, wait a minute, no, Alberti he wasn't necessarily, he was mixed, because I believe the Toltecs in Mexico and all throughout the Americas uh, were were a mixed ancestry to begin with. Also, I think they arrived the same time that the Vikings arrived in Greenland. So we know there was already a European presence in the Americas at the time of Quetzalcoatl. And Quetzalcoatl is known to look phenotypically different. There's a lot of speculations out there, which I get into. But what's interesting, I never really mentioned this on a podcast, is how the phi ratio shows up in the Mayan and Aztec long count calendars. So this is an interesting fact that not only is the architecture. So, for example, the pyramid of Teotihuacan is designed based on this ratio, but the actual calendar is based on this ratio too. Um, the most widely used calendars in pre-Columbian America was the 260-day Tzolk'in and the 365-day Haha. And that's interesting. So they had a 365-day calendar prior. I mean, look, it shouldn't be too shocking, because after all, how do you get calendars? By studying the sky.
By
We're all
watching the
looking at
sky.
the same
Yes.
sky. So yes, but to me, it just seems very hard to rationalize how the Fibonacci sequence and the phi ratio, which after all came from nature. However, it's a little bit, it doesn't completely, when you think about how difficult it is to even articulate it. Because even as long as we've had this information, it took us until the 16th century to actually put it on paper in a way that's palatable. Because it was on paper by the Egyptians. The Egyptians in the Rhine Papyrus, one of the oldest mathematical, and it wasn't even the Egyptians, it was the Hyksos, it was in Egypt during a foreign invasion of basically Canaanites. But let me proceed with the Mayan
Yeah.
here real quick,
Please,
so
please.
I don't. Okay, so this raises a crucial question: did spies utilize the correlation after G's? So G, like I said, since Alberti goes by so many different names, I had to consolidate the name under one. So when I say G, I'm basically referring to this Alberti Nezahualcóyotl character. Okay, so they deliberately created these correlations to subtly embed their influence with indigenous calendrical systems. For example, it is proposed that the Mayan eschatology was exploited by Columbus in 1502. So the conquistadors were familiar, somehow they were familiar with this. The mainstream narrative is that one of the conquistadors shacked up with one of the locals, and the local woman told them, "Oh, there's a uh, we have a belief that there's the descendants of Quetzalcoatl is going to come down and pass judgment on us right now." So they could have, that's. But I suspect that no, this is a premeditated lever that was pulled because Nezahualcoyotl's father was actually murdered in front of him. So there was definitely the locals that this spy agency was trying to subvert at some point rebelled, and this might have been a psyop to counter that. The relationship in question precisely describes the long Mayan and European dates. So the Mayan long count calendar aligns with several European dates, even like the beginning of time. For example, it goes back to like 300 and something BC, 300,000 BC, excuse me, 3000 BC, give or take, which basically aligns with the Bible's time, the creation of Earth. So that's you can't really say that has anything to do with nature. You know what I mean? Like some of the things we can say, okay, the Fibonacci sequence, fine. We can look at
Yeah,
the
it's
astronaut.
interesting you bring that up because this is something that Brad and I from the Awaken podcast we talked about. We talked about these long, like these all these different calendars. How sometimes they line up, including believing that we are on our like fifth world right now, or the fifth sun. Sorry, that's
Exactly.
yeah, this I think like that's what
Yeah.
the Aztecs believe that we're on the fifth sun.
Yeah.
And this is supported by other calendars as well. You know, other cultures that have claimed this as well.
Yes, exactly. I actually talk about that fifth sun. There's correlations with the Greeks and different Mediterranean
That's what
cultures.
that's what I yes, that's exactly where I'm alluding to is that because the I believe it is around the Greeks where they claim something along that line as well, or the Egyptians too. I can't remember.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if it was both because that's what I'm saying when you talk about the Amorites. So the Greeks, when we think about, okay, Alexander the Great, when we think of Hellenism, where did that whole thing come from? That was really set off by uh, Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, and Alexander. Now they came from the Danaeus, the Archead dynasty. I'm butchering the name, but the Argead. If your viewers notice, they'll see that if you look, who were the Argeads? Who was the Dinos? That who did these the Greeks come from? They came from these Hyksos, these Egyptian. Because for example, Cadmus was a Phoenician. The Phoenicians are basically the same people as the Amorites or the Hyksos or the Canaanites. There's so many names from them that it's so easy to get confused. But when you compress time onto a few hundred years, and you that's see, even hypothetically that the history wasn't fabricated and all history wasn't folded onto the 15th century, it's still very, very powerful to fold history just for your own, just to help you understand history better, because you'll see the patterns emerge. You'll be like, wait a minute, I can do this. See if it's even possible. See if you can take a time period, say, a few hundred years, and project it forwards or backwards. Because this is one way it helped me to
And
see
can you tell
how.
me exactly what you mean by that, by projecting a time period forward and backwards? Can you just kind of break that down just a little bit so people who are listening or watching will get a better understanding of what you mean by that?
Absolutely. So let's take the Black Death, for example, the 15th century, or it actually started more in the probably in the 13th, 12th century. But that's when it really started, like, battering. We can see the same type of idea with plague. And for example, the last time there was a huge plague on the earth, according to the historical narrative, was during the time of the Bronze Age collapse. And that was around the same time alphabet started spreading. So we had the printing press coming down with the plague, which was a similar technology of disseminating information and specifically the historical narrative, because I really think that this watch, that's really their MO, is to it's called, I label it narrative recapture, which gets into a whole like philosophy that I have. But the point is that you can see you can see echoes of the Black Death, even down to the descriptions of how people are describing it. It's almost as if, because the Black Death, it went all over the place. Like we think it just was like isolated in Europe. No, the reason that most of the Mesoamericans and Andean Americans and people in our neck of the woods passed away was, yes, there was war and stuff like that, but a lot of it was due to plague. It was Europeans escaping the plague. So this pattern we see perpetuating itself all throughout history. But in terms of answering your question specifically, so what I would encourage your viewers to do is, okay, take their favorite part of history and, you know, segregate a generation of that time period. Now move that time period. When I say move it forward and backwards, study the time period after that. Say like for me, I use hundred year chunks. I use centuries. I go century by century, and then I'll go millennium by millennium. Sometimes whole millenniums can fold on each other. Um, Now, flamenco does this in a different way. Like me, I do this through the alphabet. I do this through studying the religion. Flamenco actually has mathematical. This is the new chronology, and him and Gleb Nosovsky, because it's not just flamenco. He's got a whole team of mathematicians, astrologers. Like this was no Mickey Mouse work that I borrowed from. That's why I rely on it heavily, because after all, I'm not a mathematician, or I don't have a whole team that's able to vet. So a lot of that stuff, don't get me wrong, I vetted for myself, and I used, because his stuff was written before large language models and stuff like that. So I used a lot of these things and it's remarkable how much of the stuff that he said makes a lot of sense. Um, so yeah, in terms of folding history onto the 15th century, what I would do is I would look for the patterns. I would say, okay, what separates the difference between, in the Bronze Age collapse, we have the Sea Peoples, for example. These are Southern Europeans, you know, i.e., Greeks, Sicilians at the time, coming and invading all the known world. Egypt collapses, the Hittites, all these major empires are just gone. Not gone, because Egypt actually survived the Bronze Age collapse, but you can see it was a totally different Egypt after that point. We get into. So, but my point is that it's funny because when you ask large language model, what's the difference between these sea peoples and the conquistadors during the Age of Exploration? Because after all, these are Southern Europeans, but this time it's Spaniards and Portuguese. But it's still, we're talking about the same vicinity. These are seafaring Southern Europeans that are outperforming technologically the rest of the known world. So we see a very similar pattern. And the only act, and it's funny because this is what really blows my mind, especially when you think about the Sea Peoples and the conquistadors during the Age of Exploration. The only thing that really separates them is gunpowder. When you actually think of real technological prowess, it was really guns. I mean, they were using. You could say that there was the nautical sail, the rudder, but there's been people like Thor Heyerdahl and others that have proved that you can go from the Atlantic Ocean, from Europe to the Atlantic Ocean, without that technology. The Polynesians. There's been a lot of different cultures that have shown. So that's a good example. That's a very good example because the same technologies that the Sea Peoples introduced into other parts of the world. Well, these Sea Peoples, specifically like the Amorites, especially when they came into Egypt as the Hyksos, these are the same technologies that were introduced into the Americas. For example, the wheel, smelting metal, all these things, domestication of horses, stuff like that. So, okay, the only thing that's really that you can, it's the same general people. These are Sea people are proto Romans, for lack of a better term, proto Greco Roman people. Um, so yeah. Let me try to finish with the.
For sure,
If you
sure.
have any, did you have
No,
any other
no, we're
questions?
good. We're good. Yeah, I'm good. I mean,
All right. So we got the European annals of excuse me. Let me just. So like yeah, we were talking about the serpent one. I don't want to harp on too many things, but so they were waiting for this date, and the fall of Tenochtitlan was recorded during this specific date that apparently the Europeans had already known or was privy to, and they did use this. They used this narrative to convince the locals, and this is also gets into the whole idea of the bicameral mind, because I don't think when you ask yourself, okay, if history was folded onto the 15th century and it doesn't go back any further than the 12th century, where were humans before that? Were we behaviorally modern? My answer is no. And the reason I say that is through the work of a professor named Julian Jaynes, whose book it's called The Origin of Conscious and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. I know it's a mouthful. I'm surprised I even remembered it, because every time I try to remember it, I forget. But I said, on this episode, I'm going to remember it.
I got it.
So Julian Jaynes, he blows my mind. He argues that behavioral modernity, as we know it, in terms of introspective, in terms of self-awareness, like he calls it the introspective eye, in terms of understanding. For example, like prior to the Bronze Age collapse, Jaynes argues there's no proof of any writing when we look at Sumerian cuneiform, or any Greek texts like the Iliad or Odyssey, any of these really old texts. We always seem to be looking for guidance from gods. We're never really asking ourselves or describing how the writer or the person inside the book feels. It's always like we're projecting outwards, and the God told me to do this, and this told. And it's interesting because Julian Jaynes, there's no one that's been able to really debunk this. Now, granted, he
So
puts
you're talking like independence from, like, just to be independent, to be an individual thinker,
yes,
almost, is kind of what you're saying, like to be
right,
to look, introspectively, I guess. Yeah.
yeah. We there was very little our consciousness was more of a in a state of schizophrenia. That's the best way to describe because bicamerality is two chambers. That's what that means. And so our right hemisphere was essentially talking to our left hemisphere for, and we were using monoliths. That's why the watch, there were not everybody, there were self-aware people, but it was few and far in between. And I think these self-aware people were basically part of the watch. These were the literate people. That's why I tag everything to the alphabet, because once you get literacy and once you're able to read and write, it really helps you get away from that whole. It helps you start to look inward. But there's also a series of things. It's not just that. There's a series of events that helped us become behaviorally modern. Because Julian Jaynes does in fact say, he says, yes, it ended for most of humanity in the Bronze Age, but people were bicameral up until the Aztecs. He said that the Aztecs. That's why it was so easy for example, Cortez to hold Montezuma hostage in his own castle, because that's one thing. When you have introspective, you're also capable of deceit. Before that, you're always looking for guidance. You don't have the mental facilities to really deceive. So it's a gift and a curse, consciousness. You could say that these people were, because they weren't exactly innocent, because that's where we get child sacrifice and human sacrifice, because that schizophrenic mind, you're able to conjure up all kind of crazy friggin' shit. So I think what happened was, like, for example, Julian Jaynes describes the conquistadors coming in contact with the Aztec as a clash of two consciousnesses that the Incas weren't prepared. The Aztec, this I argue happened all over the world. It wasn't just the Aztec and the Inca in 15th century. I think that most of the world, India, China, and I get into detail on how this watch came and basically the same thing happened in so many different societies where they exploited. That's why it's all based on the narratives, because once you can control the narrative, you can control, because people, I think to this day, we still have vestiges of bicamerality in our. That's why we look to sometimes, in some cases, totalitarian dictators for guidance. They're like gods, or even like pop artists,
Yep.
musicians.
Yeah.
Sometimes we idolize
We
these
idolize. We
people.
worship them. Yeah. Now I'm wondering, what is the trigger to separate that, to become introspective? Like, is there a trigger? Was there an event? Was it a blessing or a
I think it
curse?
was
Or
several.
okay.
It was several. So it depends how, because there's so many. Like, even to this day, we're on a spectrum of consciousness. There's people alive that are far more advanced than me, and there's people alive that are not. So the point is that it depends on several things. There's environment, there's genetics. I happen to believe that our initial the time when we initially became behaviorally modern, we can see that in like things like the Venus figurines when we started molding um, like women, we started molding females basically with big breasts and big asses. Who's to say what we were using them for? I think it was like a primitive form of pornography. But the point is, that's probably just in my perverted head. The point is that when you trace the Venus figurines, we come to the conclusion that Neanderthals, this goes all the way back to Neanderthals. And I really get into the weeds in this. I've gotten to this in which we can. But basically, I'll to summarize it. So I think when we battled the weather and we had to put on clothes and when we had to, that was one step towards consciousness. Language before that, when we started to be able to talk to each other and learn each other's languages, that was another huge step. Then when we were able to write, and that was a huge that was the major step is literacy, because that's really what fundamentally changed, I think. um but I think it's a lot of it has to do with trauma. Like there's also traumatic events, like if you survive a mass cataclysm, you could be shocked into a state of consciousness, where maybe the gods are no longer being heard or something, and you have to come to terms with what happened. You know what I mean? Like, I thought God protect, you know what I mean? Like those
Or
kind of
vice
situations.
versa, you could be shocked the other way around, where you're like, just tell me, God, what I need to do, and kind of
Yes,
like almost turned off in a way.
exactly. And so it's kind of yeah, conscious. And when you get into this, it's such a it's an interesting topic, man. It's actually it's that's another therapeutic topic because it gets into who we are and how people can exploit our weaknesses, and how you can almost see how governments and like I said, these spy agencies can take advantage, not just governments, people in your life. Like I said, you can start shining the light on our own person and be like, wait a minute, this person might be a little bit more conscious than me in some ways, and that's not necessarily mean that they're a better person. They have the capacity to deceive me more. I might not be privy to that. So anyway, the relationship in question. Okay, so let me fast forward here a little bit. Okay, so what, like I was talking about, when we talk about so whoever had the alphabet and whoever was dealing, whatever cultures were really fundamentally literate, those were the people that I believe transcended the bicamerality sooner than others. And this, I you can see this in the historical record. So Apophis' Rhine papyrus. It's interesting because the two earliest forms of mathematics come from these Amorites, like I was talking about, which were Canaanites, which basically is the same people forward and backwards in time. You can still just see it's the same people, and they were the ones that originally introduced this Fibonacci or golden ratio, because this was related to the building of the pyramids.
Okay,
So
yeah.
a lot of people. Did you want to say something, right?
No, no, no. I'm just agreeing with you. I'm just agreeing. Just saying, yeah.
A lot of people associate the Great Pyramid of Giza with Kamudi or something, but there's a growing body of evidence. For example, the Rhine Papyrus. Let me read this because I'm trying to like read it and talk to it. All right, so I'm like reading it and being like trying to regurgitate it. It's better for me to just read it. So Apophis' Rhine Papyrus, meticulously annotated by his successor Kamudi, boasts of revealing all cryptic secrets. So this Rhine papyrus is one of the oldest mathematical texts in the world, and it was written in Egypt um, during the Hyksos rule, which, like I said, these are the Hyksos. The Egyptians, the word for Hyksos means foreign rulers. Um, so basically, the book says all cryptic secrets and cites pyramid measurements that implicitly rely on the value of pi. So there's pi and there's phi. Pi relates to the circle. A lot of people get that mixed up.
Yep. I
So
can see
we
I can
don't.
see why someone just hearing it might be like, oh, you're saying pi. No, no, no. I'm saying phi, not pi. Yes.
Yes, yes, and it gets even more difficult when you put a capital P on the phi because there's lowercase phi. So that's why it's easier to just say Fibonacci sequence because after all, that's really the only thing human beings we can't really articulate phi. We can only the only way we can really understand it is through the Fibonacci sequence. So emerge through. All right. So basically, we see conventional dating places the construction of the Great Pyramid in 2506 BC, yet mathematics align perfectly with the Amorite Hyksos documents, specifically Plimpton 322 from Babylon, because the Amorites weren't just ruling Egypt at the time; they were also ruling Mesopotamia, and that's where you get this Plimpton. So both these texts around the same time show this golden ratio emerge. Okay, so this that also has Pythagorean triples, and this is thousands of years before Pythagoras. So we're seeing this document, but no one's really used this information other than these foreign invaders. Because what happened was, it looks like cancel culture came from these foreign. They were eventually ousted out of Egypt, and the locals buried them. We didn't really know anything about these Hyksos until like the 19th century, and then all of a sudden, at least the public, I believe that the watch definitely had to know of this information because you could also see specific scholars throughout history citing them. But it's strange. It's almost like there's a certain intelligentsia that's aware of the Hyksos, but no schools, no Egyptologists, no one's talking about them until the 18th century.
Okay, that's
Um,
interesting. Yeah.
So knowledge of phi, the golden ratio, emerged from the triples, transversing through Amorite chiefdoms like Subala Umum, reaching ancient Greece and Arabia, and ultimately underpinning everything from Renaissance banking to architecture. Um, okay. The astonishing correlation between the pyramids, latitude, the Great Pyramid, that's the speed of light. That's not important. We talked about the golden ratio. Um, yeah, let me try not to let me yeah. So basically, with the Fibonacci sequence and the that also shows up in the Chinese calendar, specifically through the Yellow Emperor, who also there's many there's like for example the Sun Weidong is the he's like foreign affairs chief of China. He even says that Chinese civilization was seeded by one of these Amorites. So there's many correlations because, for example, the Shang Dynasty, which is the foundation of Chinese society, that when you uncover, um, the not fossils like the archaeology from those that Shang site, it's all Hyksos technology. For example, metal smelting, composite bows, the agriculture, the chariots, all these things just suddenly show up in China. But this is the same time these Hyksos get exiled from Egypt when the locals revolt. So it's interesting because the same time that these Hyksos get exiled from Egypt, we also see several different civilizations emerge. We see the Shang and Chinese. We also see the Mitanni, who, like for example, a lot of people associate Sanskrit with an Indian language, but the oldest remnants of Sanskrit actually comes from the Mitanni, which is Syria, which was where the Hyksos fled. So, and we also see that, for example, the Mitanni also spoke Amorite, which I actually get into details on the correspondences with them, but that actually, like I said, I have to preface a lot of this information with other information. So it's better to kind of like keep things a little bit more surfacey. Back to Alberti. So what I really believe happened with Alberti, because his main patrons, like I said, it was the Vatican, but there was also the most wealthy family at the time, which was the Medici family. Now, the Medici family really rose to prominence in the 15th century. However, in the 14th century, the main papal bankers was the Alberti family. The Alberti family, This is during the Avian papacy when the popes went to France. There was a certain period when the popes had to leave, got exiled from Rome, and they were stationed in France. And so, but what happens is when they came back, when the popes came back to Italy, the Medici family married into the Alberti family, and this is why I think that the Alberti family, because you have to say to yourself, where did this double entry bookkeeping system come from? How did it all of a sudden just reemerge in Florence? But we see that the phi ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, goes back to ancient Babylon and ancient Egypt by these Amorites. So these Amorites are stationed in Syria. It just so happened that the Alberti family, historical fact, they had banking. This is before the Medici family. They had banking, I guess, safe houses all throughout the world, in London and specifically in Syria. But we're talking in France, Brussels, all over Europe. But it's interesting. They were also in Syria. And Syria is like this is where these Amorites really, this is their stomping ground. After all, when we talk about Canaanites, Canaan, like today we think, oh, it's Israel or Palestine. But no, Canaan was also part of Lebanon. There was parts of Turkey that was Canaan. It was that whole Jordan, all that whole thing was Canaan. So yeah, man, that I believe that the Alberti family originally came from Canaan. And you trace this because, for example, who were the Canaanites before they were Canaanites? Who were the proto-Canaanites? You got to say the Natufians. The Natufians, they were the indigenous peoples of, if you looked at the Wikipedia page, for example, because I looked at this for Phoenicians, for Amorites, for all the indigenous populations of Canaan, and it goes back to these Natufian, these people, this culture. This culture is very interesting because they're also the first people to domesticate dogs, domesticate animals, and they're also the
That
first people to
that's a
spread
huge thing as well.
agriculture.
You're talking about and agriculture. That's huge. When we're talking about like some
There's a couple,
major
yeah,
advancements in human, like the printing press, writing. Well, domestication
yes,
and agriculture are massive.
right, and this is all historical facts. Like we when we think about Göbekli Tepe, like the oldest buildings in the world or structures, Jericho, that's Natufian stuff. We know that yes, the Natufians were in Canaan in Israel, but there's a clear line of trade between Israel and Anatolia, or modern day Turkey, and you can trace this through obsidian. There was a huge obsidian trade. And not only that, you can see the only other contemporary structures with Göbekli Tepe, which is like 8,000, 9,000 years old, is in Jericho. So the reason I bring all this up is because when you start folding history onto a few hundred years, you start to see these specific people, you can move them forward and backward, and somehow they're still responsible for the major innovations of their time. Like, so I also want to get into, yeah, let me make sure I covered the Fibonacci sequence completely, because yeah, these Amorites. Well, I should actually get into them since we have the time.
Yeah, we might. Yeah, usually I go about an hour. We're hitting an hour, but I'm more than happy to
Have
go.
we? Look at that.
Yeah, I'm
To
more
me, I
than
feel
happy
like
to
we've
keep
been
going.
talking for 10 minutes.
I know
No, no.
for me it feels like a half an hour, but let's keep going. We got we can easily do another half hour easily.
Okay, all right. So the Amorites descended from the Natufians. As the Natufians spread, evolved through the Neolithic and into the Bronze Age, they contributed genetically and culturally to all Semitic-speaking populations. Because the Natufians are also credited with being the first Afro-Asiatic speakers. Afro-Asiatic is where we get the roots of Arabic, Hebrew, all that stuff. Um, so it's interesting because when yes, the animal domestication was big, because once we started domesticating the dog, the horse followed that. And once we domesticated the horse and we combined that with composite bows and chariots, those are wheeled military vehicles. It really changed everything. But what's interesting about these Amorites, whose name literally translates to Westerners, what's west of the Greco-Roman world is west of the Levant. So they're called Westerners, which is Amorite, in the Levant. So this is why I think that this relates to the Greco-Roman world, because that's the whole Mediterranean is what's west of that. And this is why I'm like, wait a minute. So they're in Syria. Alberti's family, papal bankers, the richest family in the world prior to the Medici. The Medici intermarry with them. Somehow they get this Fibonacci sequence, and this all relates to banking. You know what I mean? It all relates to architecture. And
I've heard this before. Rothschilds as well. Like this is very similar to that family as well, with the interbreeding and banking as well. I wonder if that ties
yes,
in with
it
this as
does.
well. Mm-hmm.
It does, because Alberti's work was late, because after all, the Rothschilds, they don't really come into fruition until like the 16th set, more
Yeah,
like the 17th, 18th
yeah.
century. 18th
It's much
century
it's
is
much
actually where
further
they,
down. Yeah, but I'm wondering if they were
yes,
seeded.
there's a line.
Of
Now,
course there is.
there's not.
Of course.
It's not as direct as the Medici intermarrying with the Alberti family, which we can trace. Like, and I get into that in detail, because I spent a considerable amount of time trying to trace the Rothschild family to the Medici or even to the Alberti, and there is no real. There's nothing that's stuck. But what you do see is when you do follow the Alberti, when you do follow the watch in general, and you follow the spy agency, because what I do believe is after Alberti died, the watch it got subverted. I don't even know who the character is, because every generation there's a spy master, there's somebody in control, there's the leader, so to speak. And I don't, so I label this individual as the mole. But my
Okay,
point is that
I like
the
that.
Rothschild family doesn't necessarily have to be related to the Medici for this to make sense. Because the Rothschild, we do know, look, they were definitely involved with espionage and stuff, especially when it comes to the mail. They were funding all kinds of things. They were basically playing the same position that the Medici were, but in a more modern sense. And what for example, the spy master of the Rothschilds era was a man by the name of Francis Bacon. The last podcast I had is I got into this. Uh, but with the Rothschilds, actually, I could bring them up because I do mention them in my book.
Why not?
Um,
Let's go.
yeah, a lot of the Rothschild stuff, quite frankly, is because they're involved, but they're even with the Medici. Like, just a lot of times, it's very easy to demonize the rich people. But look, for all intent and purposes, they did a lot of good too. I'm sure there's some rotten apples, but you don't want to necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Well,
When
if
I,
we're talking
especially when I
Rothschilds,
say,
if we're talking Rothschilds, I'm not in that camp. I would say that they've done a lot of bad. Like maybe
yeah,
they've done good, but it was to serve other purposes, almost in a way. Yeah.
I'm sure. I mean, I think yeah. But for example, with the Rothschilds, it was difficult for me to find a lot of things that stuck. But I will bring it. The Rothschilds are the richest private banking family in modern history. While there's no documented connection between Francis Bacon and the Rothschild family, some interpretations link them to representatives of a hidden control over science and finance. One ideological, the other monetary. The Medici had largely declined in the 1730s, just before Michael Anthony Rothschild began his ascendancy in Germany. German scholars like Miller, Bayer, and Schnitzel created a modern version of Russian history during this time. So, in terms of you know Fomenko's work, it just so happens that Fomenko's work ties into this time of the Rothschild. Because I argue a lot of this stuff happened during the time of Medici and the Alberti, but the main scholars in this line of thought actually tag it to the Rothschild, not necessarily the Rothschild, because he doesn't even mention the Rothschild, but that time period, because the Rothschilds, after all, they funded a lot of the things that happened in London. This is when England and Great Britain came to become a huge global power. Eventually, it became the biggest empire in history. Now, the point is that they funded all sides. So yes, there's definitely a self. I don't think it's a selfless organization. So, like the Medici, the Rothschild dynasty was a powerful European banking family that significantly influenced geopolitics through finance, notably funding the British during the Neoplatonic Wars and later supporting infrastructure projects, government loans, and early Zionist settlements. Through though exaggerated, conspiracy theories often distort their role. And this is why I think so, is because usually whenever you hear the Rothschilds, you hear about the Sabbateans, or you hear about the Jacob Frank or the Frankists, or it's another. So this usually relates to the secretive movements rooted to the messianic claims of Sabbatai Zevi and Jacob Frank, who sought refuge in the Habsburg dynasty. These sects infiltrated political and commercial spheres with the Don May faction, aiding the Young Turks in dismantling the Ottoman Empire. So, yeah, that's a whole thing. I actually was going to write a whole book on Sabbatai Zevi, Jacob Frank, and the Rothschilds because there is a huge story to tell there.
Yeah, there
However,
there
in
are a
terms of
lot of stories. Yes, definitely. Like every avenue that we're talking about, we go so much deeper on them as well.
yeah, bro, yeah, it will. I'll come back. I'll come back because
Yeah,
there's
for sure.
like there is like you said, I can keep going on and on, especially with you, Rod. You're awesome to talk to, man. I appreciate you, bro.
Not a problem. Not a problem. Do we want to angle this into like wrapping up? Like, do you want to like hit a point where then we can wrap it up so we can keep like a tie it with a nice little bow until next time, or do we got something further that we want to that you would like to discuss?
No, yeah, we could kind of wrap it up with so after the Rothschilds who came from Germany. This is where we get the German Rosicrucians from. There's also a specific Jesuit named Athanasius Kircher, who I've gotten into in other podcasts, but he's considered the last Renaissance man. So we can see there's a line of people that are following the work of Alberti, and these lead to technological innovations in modern day. And so we can get into spy rings in the modern day and how
So was
it
Alberti
harkens.
kind of almost like this main collective consciousness or like this main idea creator that people pulled off of it and actually like continued his work? Like he kind of was like, okay, he was
Yes.
like you said, he said he was the first architect. Could he not just be the first architect of everything, of all these inventions, where he was the initial
Well,
architect of it all, and then maybe I don't know, maybe that's too far for it because the actual architect would be like Leonardo or something like that.
right.
But but he was the muse almost in a way. You know, I don't know.
Yeah, in so many words. Yeah, I mean, I you can say that, but he goes back though. He goes back. I think what you could really trace all this back to is the time of Quetzalcoatl. That's in the 12th century. I think these were the proto-humanists because when you look at who these Toltecs were, they were artisans. They were basically, musicians, and granted, they were warriors, but if you actually think about the cult of Quetzalcoatl, they were they were opposed to human sacrifice. They were trying to they were talking about an unknowing God of everywhere, almost like a monotheistic. They were trying to. I don't think they were necessarily the bad guys. Uh, Obviously I wasn't there, so I don't want to completely co-sign that. And for all intent and purposes, in 1 month I get some new information. I'm like, wait a minute, I should have took that back. That was recorded.
Retract that one.
But
But it's interesting
yeah,
though. But if the cult of Quetzalcoatl were against human sacrifices, that's a big thing because because that ended up becoming a big thing of the Aztec Empire.
right.
Was the
Well, that's the
sacrifices
thing.
to, and we're talking tens of thousands of sacrifices.
Yes. Now, mind you, the cult of Quetzalcoatl was vast. I mean, the Toltec, there was people worshiping Quetzalcoatl in Guatemala and all over the Americas. So, so when I say, for example, Quetzalcoatl's great grandson Nezahualcóyotl, who I believe this is Alberti's original name is Nezahualcóyotl, he was really very much opposed to human sacrifice. I can't speak for all the Toltecs, but I could speak for Quetzalcoatl. We know Quetzalcoatl was opposed to human sacrifice, the actual cult leader, so to speak. He was actually considered a nice guy if you actually by the locals too. I think the locals just they wanted, I guess, a local person in control. I don't know what happened, but he was exiled, and that the whole idea of Cortez coming back with the shiny suit and wearing armor and stuff, that was all like stuff that was written in their text saying
It
there's going to
was
be some
they
people,
assumed that was the return. Yeah.
right? So, I mean, that's why I think a lot of this stuff is subversion. A lot of these myths, a lot of our history. A lot of the religions that we practice, and I get into this in other podcasts. And no one's really exempt from this. This goes to the Jews, the Christians, the Muslims, the Hindus. Every single civilization, I believe, at some capacity, has been compromised by this agency, so to speak, because they it's all a matter of the reconciled combatant. So it's a reverse psychology. Like I said, there's a term I use for this called narrative recapture, and you basically you change the history, and you create a narrative, a creation myth for a civilization that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy of their own destruction. So, but and the levers can be pulled at any given moment. We can see this in modern day religions. We can see this in modern day organizations that they're sophisticated, man. I think. I mean, granted, I don't know if it's every single culture, but the main ones that are around still that we associate with being ancient. The only reason that they're still around is because I think that they're wrapped up with this intelligence agency. But after all, guys, I don't want, look, if I leave you with anything, I don't want this to be a paranoid thing where, you're looking for conspiracies in every angle. And, what do you mean? I still study philosophy and all these beautiful things of history. There's still a lot of knowledge there, regardless if it was compacted in a few hundred years or in fact it went on for a millennium. It's still there. And I believe that the historical timeline is in chronological order. Don't get me wrong. Like the Sumerians came, the Egyptians came, the Greeks, so on and so forth. In order. It's just compacted. You understand?
Okay. Yeah.
So
So
if I leave you
it's not
guys
so
with any,
spread out. It's much more um, shorter time periods than what you're saying is.
exactly right. And so anyway, if I could leave you guys with anything, it's question history. I don't pretend like I know all the answers. I'm just looking for patterns. That's what we are. We're pattern recognition machines. And I think as long as we are aware of that, we could we could live a lot better, and we could have a lot more knowledge of not only our past but our futures.
Yeah. Fantastic, Michael. I want to say thank you so much for spending the time and dropping some bombs of information here. You've done a lot of research and it's very interesting, and I think it adds more questions, which is important. That's the way things should be. Is we should be adding more questions onto this all. So one last time, where can everybody find you?
So I'm at michaelanthonyalberta.com or YouTube at Michael Alberta, just Michael Alberta.
Okay, okay, for sure.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you so
Awesome,
much.
man.
Yeah, for sure. Everyone, that was Michael, and he brought some information. He brought a lot of information, and as usual, more questions than answers. Well, I guess there is answers. He's bringing answers, but of course that leads us to more. Whenever we get one answer, we come up with 10 more questions. So this is extremely important that we continue to research and look into things. And with this hidden hand kind of controlling and manipulating our history, I I believe that wholeheartedly. It takes, like I've said, it takes one generation to forget the truth. We can rewrite. They can write what they want in the history books, and it takes that generation that was there, that experienced it, who know the truth, to die. And a lot of times, we don't pass on our history anymore. We used to pass it on through stories, but now with written, and like Michael was saying about, we have that choice now where we can, that introspective, where we can be deceitful. And that is exactly what is happening. The watch is conducting these experiments, these deceitful experiments of rewriting history. And one generation, that next generation that comes in who learns it, who learns the written false narrative, that is our beliefs then. So we have to make sure that we document everything. We know the truth, and we have to fight for the truth. We have to be the truth seekers, and we have to fight for the truth, even if it is ridicule. It happens so many times. So many times when I post or I comment about the actual truth, I get ridiculed. It is what it is. I'm ready to stand up. Are you? And with that, everyone, this is Rye the Codega signing off for another evening. Keep your curiosity wandering, keep the light lit, and always, always find your way home.
Beneath the stars where shadows grow, the Nephilim's echoes whisper low. Bigfoot roams through the forest deep, and Dogman prowls where the brave won't sleep. Across lost history we wonder why, seeking the truth that time tried to hide. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit, through the darkness don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come, and always find your way back home. Streak through the velvet skies, aliens watch with unblinking eyes. The paranormal hums where silence breaks, in the void of secrets a lantern wakes. Through hidden realms and stories untold, the Codex flame is a light to hold. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit, through the darkness don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come, and always find your way back home. UFOs streak through the velvet skies, aliens watch with unblinking eyes. The paranormal hums where silence breaks, in the void of secrets a lantern wakes. Through hidden realms and stories untold, the Codex flame is a light to hold. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit, through the darkness don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come, and always find your way back home. Legends rise from the earth's deep core, a lost legacy we can't ignore. With every step, the veil grows thin, revealing worlds where the strange begins. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit, through the darkness don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come, and always find your way back.